Literature can challenge us and make us upset and make us angry. It can be full of horrific people doing horrific things. As long as it's interesting, as long as it teaches us something, it compels us to think about themes and morals. What's wrong with any of that? I am absolutely sick and tired of this running commentary, this constant argument, this exhausting and frankly very, very boring narrative that characters in fiction have to be likable. Oh my god. Shut up. This is so boring. I cannot stand this. I need it to stop right now. When did this happen? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Just a little trigger warning for any cishet men watching this. I am going to talk about sexism, because sexism is part of it. So let's talk about why a character in a book or a film or a video game or a TV show, and especially a protagonist, does not have to be likable, and does not have to be a good person. A good character or a likable character does not a good book make. And here's why. First off, I'm just going to lay out the most valuable thing that I can say on this subject, and I did not come up with this, but unfortunately I can't remember who did. I could have been watching a talk, I might have been on Twitter, I might have been watching an interview on YouTube, I might have been talking to an author. I was somewhere doing something when an author, and I don't remember who this was, said this, and it really stuck with me because I have believed this for a long time, but when this author said this, whoever they were, they put into words what I believe, what I know to be true, in the most succinct and beautiful way possible, and here it is. A character, and especially a protagonist, doesn't have to be likable or good. They just have to be interesting. That's it. And interesting can mean a lot of different things. It can mean good. It can mean heroic. It can mean respectable. It can mean someone that you will look up to and admire. And it can also mean someone who is psychopathic. Someone who is broken and flawed. Someone who does horrible and dangerous and terrible abusive things. It can mean someone that you would never talk to in real life, never go near. Just make them interesting. If it's literary fiction, make them someone who thematically and conceptually and relationship-wise does something interesting, represents something interesting, something worth talking and thinking about. If it's genre fiction, you can make them whatever you want. Make your fantasy protagonist an abusive, murderous Viking man. Just make him interesting. Just write him well. Write his relationships well. Write his backstory well. That's all I want. I will enjoy hating him and maybe even feeling frightened of him. Just make him interesting. Give me a reason to keep reading other than he's nice and I like him. Went a bit Welsh then. I do not understand this obsession with likable characters. I read a lot of horror. And horror is full of dreadful people. Protagonists who are in fact villains. Protagonists who are undeniably good but have to do really terrible things to survive. What's wrong with any of this? What's wrong with making our characters interesting? And as I said at the beginning, sexism plays a part because while preparing to make this video, I went through all my different books and found as many examples of unlikable, not very good protagonists that I could find, and 90% of the books I found were written by women. The only prominent male author that I could think of who famously writes really consistently unlikable characters is also my favourite author, Kazuo Ishiguro. I don't think Kazuo Ishiguro has ever written a particularly likable protagonist, because he's not interested in making the reader like them, he's interested in making them good, interesting characters to read about. Dynamic, flawed, human, broken. People who are actually compelling. The protagonists of The Remains of the Day, Never Let Me Go, The Unconsoled, all of these characters are flawed and broken. And they have good reasons to be. Stevens is a great example of this. This is a very pathetic, very naive man who has been entrapped and encased and sheltered by tradition and conservatism. He's a moron. He's so flawed and so broken, but there is hope for him. And you enjoy that hope. And even if there isn't, it's so interesting reading about how this guy was suckered into believing that tradition is the most important thing in the world. That's fascinating to me. I wouldn't like Stevens if I met him. How could I? But he's a brilliant character. And here I've got 3 contemporary female authors who all famously write really unlikable characters. You've got Otessa Moshfegh, Melissa Broder, and Sayaka Murata. All 3 of these writers famously write really, really terrible, horrible, unlikable protagonists. Great. The Pisces is such a great example of this. You've got a woman who is absolutely racked with depression and anxiety and existential crises. She's been let down by men over and over again. And throughout the course of the story, she does so many horrible things. She ruins the lives of people. People in her family. She is a wrecking ball of a human being. She is abhorrent. And she's interesting. She does really weird and wacky and horrible things. Wonderfully awful sexual things. She is depraved and fantastic and interesting. She's interesting. I have read literally dozens of Goodreads reviews and Amazon reviews about this book talking about how awful the protagonist is. As if that's some nail in the coffin, some death sentence, a reason to hang this book. This very, very good, very, very interesting book. To the point that I actually ages ago made a video where I reacted to 1-star reviews of this book from morons who just didn't like her, and she was unlikable, and she wasn't very good, and she was mean and nasty, and she was interesting? Why are people afraid of that? Jesus Christ. Sayaka Murata's books get so much hate for this as well. She often writes very, very innocent people who just get struck with so much tragedy because they don't like or don't accept or don't understand how the world around them works. They're people who don't fit into society. In Convenience Store Woman, the way that that's expressed is pretty grounded. In Earthlings, it very, very much isn't. This is a book with 1,000 trigger warnings. There's so much stuff in here to upset people. All of that is valid. If you get upset by the events in this book, I understand that. I am not going to take that away from you. This is a book full of really, really horrible assault and abuse, and if you don't like that, yeah, of course, I get it. I sympathize, I empathize, I really understand. But if you don't like her books because her characters aren't likable enough, that's boring. That's not an excuse. And then you've got Otessa Moshfegh, who enjoys all of this, undeniably. You can tell from interviews with her. She loves the fact that people dislike her books. She loves the fact that her characters are unlikable, and she doesn't seem to understand why that's a bad thing, and I don't either, honestly. Like, my review of Lapvona was called something like, "It's just a good book, what are people so mad about?" Like, this is a very good book full of very good characters. They're just not good, but they are good. They're interesting. This is a book full of depravity, of crime and abuse and torture and gaslighting and murder, blood and gore. It's a medieval setting, a lawless place, and it's so much fun. And people seem to forget about the classics. Look back through the history of classic literature, especially the Gothic. Wuthering Heights, not a single nice person. Wuthering Heights is a collection of arseholes, all being terrible to each other. Just a house full of monsters being monsters. Heathcliff is not a romantic hero. He's a bastard, a horrible, nasty, depraved man who has been abused all of his life, so you kind of understand why he's so awful. Cathy is just a spoiled brat who then dies. And then you've got my favourite book ever, Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley. Again, book after book after book that I talk about here were written by women. Great, women know how to write arsehole characters. Love that. Victor Frankenstein is the real monster. That's a meme at this point. But he is a monster, yes. And then his creature does really horrible, terrible things because he was raised without a father. That's the whole metaphor of the book, is about parents abandoning their children and not doing a good job of raising them and not taking responsibility for the things that they do, the things they create, especially men, especially fathers. And Mary Shelley was talking specifically about her husband, Percy Shelley, an awful, horrible man. And because the creature doesn't really have a moral compass, because it wasn't raised properly, it does some really horrible things, like commit murder. But it's also a sympathetic and tragic hero in a lot of ways. But you don't become a tragic hero without tragedy, and that tragedy means that it does some really fucked up, horrible stuff. Here's a book I read really recently, also by a woman, Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is one of my favorite books of 2023, an amazing novel. The protagonist is a villain. Now, as a Chinese-American writer, R.F. Kuang is making a specific point about plagiarism, about racism within the publishing industry, about favoritism, and about cultural appropriation. And she does all that by creating a very compelling, villainous, horrible, white protagonist. Great stuff. The point that I've made with all of this, the fact that so many women writers write horrible protagonists and people don't seem to like it, is patriarchy. The expectation that women create nice stories with likable protagonists, that women will write romance stories with lovable heroes and sweet maidens. But for 200 plus years, women have been writing depravity and it's been glorious. And that just seems to bother people. People expect female characters. Literature can challenge us and make us upset and make us angry. It can be full of horrific people doing horrific things. As long as it's interesting, as long as it teaches us something, it compels us to think about themes and morals. What's wrong with any of that? Writers writing amazing women characters who are monstrous, unhinged creatures. It shocks and upsets people in ways that perhaps they didn't even expect and they might not even be able to verbalize, but it's there. They're upset that you've got women characters being horrible. Good, great. Because it turns out, against all odds, that women are in fact people. And people are awful. Why does this seem to shock and surprise so many readers? And aside from the women writers, women characters, all of that stuff, sexism, blah, 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 I'm also just tired of the idea of this false and boring narrative that characters have to be good and likable for a book to be good. Every book I've mentioned here is a good book. There aren't many people out there who think Frankenstein is a bad book. There aren't many people out there who think Kazuo Ishiguro is a bad writer. And yet Frankenstein is full of horrible people. Ishiguro writes flawed and broken protagonists, unlikable people that you wouldn't want to have a pint with. What's wrong with that? This is great literature. Literature is not here to be likable. Literature is not here to create happy stories for people to go, ooh, that was nice, yay. Literature can challenge us and make us upset and make us angry. It can be full of horrific people doing horrific things. As long as it's interesting, as long as it teaches us something, it compels us to think about themes and morals. What's wrong with any of that? These books can be political, they can be critical, these are good things, and if their protagonists are nasty people as a result of the themes and the ideas that they want to get across, great. The book wins, the book is good, the characters are interesting. Let's move on now. I really don't get it. There's this one thing about Poirot that bugs me. Agatha Christie herself was shocked that people like Poirot as a character. She wrote him to be an unlikable, smug douche. And he is. He's horrible. I hate Poirot. So even Agatha Christie was trying to write bad characters, and she did succeed. Murder mysteries are known for being wholesome things, for being charming and sweet and fun. Poirot's still an arsehole. There's nothing wrong with this. Make characters interesting. Not good, not wholesome, not likable, interesting. Whatever that means. There you go. End of rant. God, I was talking for a long time. Subscribe for books.